Good evening and welcome to A Slice of Life. I'm your host, Jim Therrien. Tonight's topic of discussion is going to be something called invasive plants. My guest tonight is Kathy Conley. You may recognize her name from numerous articles in the Harbor News. And she's here tonight to tell us about invasive plants, problems, solutions. But Kathy, welcome to A Slice of Life.
Thank you very much.
Now, as well as being into invasive plants, I also understand you're a native plant enthusiast.
I am. I spent a lot of time trying to learn about them and grow them and find them and all of that, yeah.
And what kept you involved in native plants?
Oh, well, there are a lot of good reasons for us to care about native plants today. They're very important to all the wildlife around us.
Right.
And they're having a hard time finding a toehold in nature. So a lot of us need to put them in our yards.
And could that difficult in toehold be related to invasive plants?
Yes, it could, Jim. Oh, well, yes, it could.
Let's start with question one.
Okay.
What is an invasive plant?
Well, a lot of people are surprised to learn that an invasive plant is different from a weed. There's an overlap, but a weed is simply defined as any unwanted plant. That could be a native plant that you don't want on your property, like you mentioned to me before about jewelweed.
Right.
And how vigorous they are and how many of them you get.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, if you remove them, you might be removing them because they're unwanted, meaning they're weeds in your yard, in your.
I have actually weeded jewelweed.
There you go.
Yeah.
So a weed is just an unwanted plant. An invasive plant actually meets a set of definitions that are rather exacting. And so there's a big difference between the two.
Now, I did some research, and I understand that the criteria for an invasive plant is about 9 items long.
That's correct.
And who determined that?
Well, it's a complicated relationship and a complicated history, but it's actually an act of our state legislature where they accepted the criteria that were given to them by a group of scientists.
Okay.
And so the criteria for invasive plant status were defined by a variety of experts, and then it was made, it's governed by state law or state statute.
Now, if a plant only meets 6 or 7 of the criteria, they may not be native, but are they therefore invasive?
Well, usually in that circumstance, or often in that circumstance, they'll be put onto a watch list where the state's Invasive Plants Council will watch their progress on the landscape. And if they become very populous, very aggressive, start to interfere with farming or with other land uses, they may very well wind up, they may start to look like they meet more than those 6 criteria, let's say.
Okay. Now, why should I remove invasive plants from my yard or my gardens?
I think so.
Okay.
And the tricky part comes in when an invasive plant is also a beautiful plant. You know, we have quite a number, actually, of beautiful but invasive plants.
Right.
One that I think of quickly, Chinese wisteria. Beautiful spring blossoms, but it is positively an invasive plant.
And in my research, I discovered and I think we'll show one of the pictures later on, of this Dame's rocket, I believe.
Yes.
Pretty pink flower. It's just really delightful.
It's delightful to look at, but it takes over like crazy.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, boy.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're going to go on to, let's go on to question 3.
Yep.
Invasive, how can I identify invasive plants? We have a list of things that we're going to bring up, but how do we go about telling like a native bittersweet from a Chinese oriental bittersweet?
It can sometimes be very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And that sometimes you have to take it to an expert. For instance, at the Yukon Home and Garden Center,
Right.
you can send in samples or pictures.
Right.
At the Connecticut Ag Station, they will
right.
take a look at your plants and help you tell apart. So with American and Oriental Bittersweet are two that are very hard to tell apart.
Yeah.
There are guides online that are good at helping us with that.
Yeah,
There's one in particular called Mistaken Identity, where they address exactly the plant that you just mentioned,
Right.
the American versus Oriental Bittersweet.
Yeah, yeah.
And about, I'd say, 60 other plants that they show.
Now, behind us, we have some plants, invasive plants that are on display.
Yep.
And I got to tell you, some of these look very familiar. This one here in the lower right, mugwort.
Oh, yeah.
I have that in my backyard, I know that. And here's, of course, the Oriental Bittersweet. The question is, what do you do when you've identified this? How do you, So I was actually listening to this in my research also. There's this list of Connecticut invasive plant list, and there's 97 items on this.
That's right.
This stuff has to be everywhere.
It is.
My God.
It is. It's taking up a lot of space.
Yeah.
One thing about land, they're not making any more of it.
Yeah.
And so when it gets taken up by a plant that is a danger to local ecology for a variety of reasons,
Right.
It's a good idea to get rid of it, even if it's pretty.
Now, what would you say is probably the most aggressive invasive plant that we have to deal with?
So in our region, that varies by region, but I can tell you that Phragmites is everywhere.
Yes.
We know that. Certainly Oriental Bittersweet. Japanese knotweed is a huge problem.
Right, right.
And Tree of Heaven is what I call a double threat. The reason that I call it that is not only is it an extremely aggressive invasive plant, but it also is a host for spotted lanternfly.
Oh.
It's sort of the number one host for spotted lanternfly.
Right.
And as that scourge is making its way up the coastline from where it started in Pennsylvania, the fact that we have so much Tree of Heaven is a really big problem.
Well, Tree of Heaven sounds like a delightful plant.
Yeah.
It's hard to think that it's so wicked, I guess we could call it.
It is. It's a clonal plant. And so
What
that
is
means that it's, well, first of all, it's a tree, so it can get as much as 80 feet tall.
Whoa.
So if it was just one single 80-foot tree,
Oh, I
well, that's bad enough.
Right, right.
But what it does is put out an intense group of clones by roots. It spreads by the root, and it will spread its roots as much as 100 or even 150 feet from the original parent plant.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the clones come up and they form dense colonies. They can take over an area. It puts out a substance from the roots that makes it unfriendly to other plants. And it has all sorts of nasty characteristics.
Now, doesn't black walnut do kind of the same thing?
You're thinking of juglone, which is the chemical that is exuded by the roots of walnut
I didn't know I
trees.
was thinking about that.
Yeah, and people say that, yes, that's the case.
Yeah.
In the case, there are many, many plants that put out root exudates. Certainly mugwort is one of them.
Yeah.
Crabgrass is one of them.
Right.
In fact, it may be that most plants, I can't guarantee this, but I think many, many plants put out exudates from their roots that change the soil to favor their existence. Big surprise, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now, how did you get started in, I understand you're a landscaper. How did you get started in focusing in on these invasive plants?
Well, quite simply, people would invite me to come and look at their properties, and inevitably the conversation would turn to that corner of the yard or that corner of the yard, or something come across a fence from their neighbors that they didn't want. And it became so clear to me that I had to learn about these plants. They were everywhere and making people rather unhappy in a lot of circumstances.
Right.
And so it became a requirement of the job.
So now, let's just go back to this list here, if we can. This is 97 plants on this list that have met the 9-item criteria list?
That is my understanding.
Okay, and we can safely assume, I assume, that there are some plants that aren't on this list by only 1 or 2 criteria and are still problematic.
Yeah, and some of those are on the watch list.
Right.
I believe there are about 9 plants on the watch list right now. I'm not entirely sure of that, but yeah, that is correct.
Okay, so now I want to take a minute and mention the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah.
Because I encountered that name a lot in my research.
Yeah. It's a consortium of concerned scientists and citizens.
Yeah.
It's coordinated through UConn, but it's independent of UConn. It's not a membership group. It's basically a group of people who are concerned. They come to meetings, give presentations to the public, and make sure that information is getting out there.
Okay. Now, I was just told to focus on a new set of pictures that we have here. And of course, there's our ever-present common reed, Phragmites.
Right.
And that is just everywhere.
Yep.
And I think the problem with Phragmites is it's taking away from marsh or swamp plants that should be growing there, that our native birds and animals can benefit from.
That's exactly right.
But I don't think anything benefits from Phragmites.
Well, if we had birders here tonight, there is some argument in favor of the bird habitat and the bird food that it creates.
Yeah.
Although in an ideal world, we would have our native Phragmites and some of our other salt marsh grasses
right.
that were there until Phragmites took over.
Yeah, that's... Now, look at this autumn olive here.
Yep.
If you may. That's kind of a pretty flower. And again, like I said,
yeah,
they're pretty flowers, but
that's right.
It's just like, I guess, the dark horse in the botanical world.
Yes, I'm afraid that's a good way to describe it. They are dark horses.
Okay, kudos for me there.
Yeah.
All right, so now I want to take a minute, and when you go to a website, hold on now. When you go to the one, at the end of this program, we're going to have a website on the banner in the bottom. And when you go to that website, you'll get this document. And it's about 8 pages long, and it's actually very informative. But the thing I want to direct you to is on page 4, and it has all these links that you can go to, and they are just a treasure of information. And one of the things I want to direct you to, and again, the Field Guide Plant Management Calendar. That is very, very informative, and it's like what you get in any catalog at like Burpee or whatever. They have information when it blooms, whether it likes darker shade, darker sunshine. And again, this is just marvelous information.
We have a treasure chest of information.
Yeah.
It's a question of taking the time to go and do the learning, to do the identification, to make a plan, to remove these rather dangerous plants.
I would have to imagine this can be a very big job.
Well, to get started, it feels big, but what I've found over time is that I've developed a routine for how to research things and what to do about it. University extension services all over the country have studied in one or another of them, has studied absolutely every plant on the list.
Wow.
Yukon certainly
Yeah.
provides information on the top 20 or 25 plants
Right.
on that SIPWIG website, SIPWIG
Right.
being the Connecticut Invasive Plants Working Group. So you get used to it, and it becomes much easier as time goes on.
Now, I want to go into question number 5 on my list here, and how should we properly dispose of invasive plants? And, whoops, I want to go ahead and look at some of these, hold on now, look at some of these plants and how to dispose of them.
While you're doing that, maybe
Yeah.
I could just say that this is one of the most important topics for people to understand. That when we cut stuff down in our yards, we need to let it dry in the sun or in some other way, really die. Because if you
here we
simply
go.
take it to the brush dump,
Right.
all you're doing is taking living material and their seeds and adding it into the public waste stream, where
Right.
eventually somebody else will pick it up. So we're kind of recirculating each other's weeds.
Well, now, so it's good that you mentioned that. Now let's talk about this. I have this thing on the camera about how to dry them, but tell us about this, if you will.
Well, just for fun, back in February,
Yep.
when I knew we were going to do this show, I
Right.
went to my compost pile and pulled out, a shovelful or two of compost.
Right.
Now, I took it from the hopefully finished portion of the compost,
Right.
and to see if I put it under grow lights in the garage, put
Right.
a little lid on it, would it grow anything?
Right.
Were there seeds, viable seeds
Yeah.
in the compost? Well, you can see what we got.
Apparently it grows a lot of stuff.
Yes, it does. And this was from the part of my compost that has been turned quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so it needs more turning. It needs more heating up.
Right.
This is not finished compost.
Oh, well, as another example, in Old Saybrook, we have a wonderful compost program where they take the leaves and they compost them over time. And I use that in my garden. And one year, I actually had a pumpkin start growing in my rose bushes. And so it may be composted, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the compost gets hot enough to kill the weeds and
That's
stuff.
right. And so one thing you can do when you bring material home from, whether it's from a topsoil supplier or a compost supplier, is you let it sit. You don't use it right away. You let it sit for several months and turn it so that you're sure that nothing is growing out of it.
Right.
And that way you give yourself a fair fighting chance of not having that result.
So here we have the porcelain berry slide.
Oh.
And this, when you drive along the highway, this is just everywhere.
Yes, it is.
And how do we kill it is basically the question.
Not easily. It is one of our harder plants to
Yeah.
kill. One of the problems is that the birds love the berries. Another problem is that it's a beautiful plant and a lot of people like it, and you can still buy it in garden centers. It is not, even though it's on the state list, it is not forbidden for sale. Yeah,
That's actually quite surprising.
but it's true.
All right, so now that actually brings up another topic of discussion. Some plants, like I said, are pretty. And how do we, and the problem is, can we dictate to a nursery center that you can't sell this if people are saying, oh, I like it, it's very pretty?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Yeah, I don't think we can dictate that.
Well, there are plants that are banned for sale, but there are about 15, I believe, on
Yeah.
the state list that are not banned for sale. And it's partly because they haven't been deemed to cause enough economic damage.
Oh, and I assume that's one of the 9 criteria.
It is, it's in
Yeah.
there, right. So it's a fine line, and we also today, we all have the internet, and I can go and buy just about any plant I want somewhere in the country
Yeah.
and have it delivered directly to my house.
Right.
And so it's a problem. And a lot of people ask that question. It's a very frustrating question to
Yes.
those of us who are concerned about this issue.
Do you have pictures to share?
Well, what I have is a list of plants that you can still buy.
Actually, that one you have here is what I'm displaying here.
Yeah.
But that's the better picture, so let's look at that. Like I said, it's a pretty plant, pink flowers.
Right, Dame's rocket.
Pretty tall looking.
Yep. It'll take over on the edge of your yard, in
Yeah.
your garden, in your lawn.
Yeah.
It develops runners. It puts out tons of seeds.
Now,
yeah.
is the issue for the individual pollinator that the mouth parts don't match up perfectly with the stamen and all that stuff?
There are cases where that's the case.
Yeah.
That is the world's most complicated topic.
Oh, I'm
there-
sorry.
Yeah, and I'm no expert on it, but
Yeah.
what I can say is that in the world of insects, and this is at the highest level, this is an important piece of information I don't think a lot of people have.
Right.
In the world of insects, we have insects that are feeding specialists and others that are feeding generalists. And the generalists are capable of using a whole lot more plants for whether it's they need nectar or they're gathering pollen
Yeah.
or they are looking for a place to host their larvae.
Right.
So some insects are capable of using maybe a few plants, others are capable of using a lot of plants.
Wow.
The spotted lanternfly is
Right.
capable of using up to 100 varieties of trees. Although they prefer the tree of heaven, they seem to prefer the tree of heaven.
Yeah.
They can use all your sugar maples, walnuts.
Yeah.
So they are generalists in that regard, but there are insects, very important insects, that are feeding specialists. And the specialists really lose out big time
Right.
when it comes to this question of invasive plants.
Right.
Invasive plants offer them nothing.
Then, I keep looking at this list of 97 plants, and I think, how did this ever get rolling? But before we go there, and before we close out for the evening, I want to mention that this document can be found on the Old Saybrook's Conservation Commission webpage. And I'm certain that because invasive plants are becoming such a big problem, that your town probably has this similar document on its conservation page. And yeah, that's the one right there. So I would either write that down or take a picture with your phone. It seems like everybody takes pictures with their phones now.
Or go to the Old Saybrook website, there's a search bar, and simply type in invasive plants.
There you go. And that just displays your level of computer savviness and not mine. But anyway, so so if, and this program is being filmed in late March, just a couple of weeks from when the whole earth explodes in springtime, when the leaves will help you identify which plants are out there and which plants are in your backyard. I myself am planning on going through this summer and purging my gardens. But again, you got to wait till the leaves show up. And so if you do that, you'll be helping your native flora and fauna.
That's right.
And eventually that's really what we want to do. So I would ask, is the agricultural research station down in New Haven a good source of information?
The best.
Really?
Yeah. So that's the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station.
Yeah, oh, that's right.
ct.gov/CAES. It's a short URL. And they have phenomenal information on not just invasive plants, but on insects and all kinds of plants, and soil and anything related to growing in the earth.
Yeah.
And then the other one is the SIPWIG website, specific to the Connecticut Invasive Plants Working Group.
Right.
SIPWIG.UConn.edu. is another one.
Yep.
Both
So
very, very helpful.
I guess the takeaway here is that if you believe you have an invasive plant problem, there are plenty of informational sources to help
Yeah.
you in cleaning up your garden and actually getting rid of them. Do you have any closing comments, Kathy?
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. It has become a little bit of an obsession with me.
Yeah.
And what I hope people come to understand is that these plants are biological pollution.
Oh, excellent point. Excellent point. Yep.
They really are a form of pollution. They are trash. Whether they're pretty or not, they are not helping us, ultimately us, but certainly not helping all the creatures around us. So I hope people start to take the problem very seriously.
And not to go into another tangent this late in the show, but there's also aquatic invasive
Oh
plants.
my, yes.
Which could be a whole nother show, of course.
Yes, it could.
So anyways, this is the Invasive Plant Show. I thank you for tuning in. And until next time, have a good day.